Today we'll examine the debate in Venice in 1630 over a communal ban against gambling. Local leaders moved to outlaw games of chance, but Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modena pushed back, arguing that the community had no right to restrict a Jew's freedom in this area. Along the way, we examine the authorship of an anonymous 1595 dialogue on gambling, which offers an overview of the halachic arguments and a window into public attitudes about this subject at that time. The story comes full circle as we turn to explore Rabbi Modena's unique and candid autobiography. Was a rabbi who lived in Venice in the 1500s and the 1600s. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena. He's a very interesting character, and he's a little bit hard to define. So I'm going to use the Chida's definition for him. The Chida wrote a Sefer Shem HaGdolim, where it's a catalog of many of the great Rabbanim that lived before his day. The Chida defines him as Me Rabbane Venezia, one of the rabbis in Venice. Medaktek, he was into diktuk, umeshoider, he wrote poetry, vidarshan, and he was also a preacher. He also gave drushes in the ghetto in Venice. That's where he lived. And he has a sefer, a Shalos HaTshuvos. It's called Shalos HaTshuvos Ziknei Yehuda. It was printed for the first time in 1956. However, the particular tshuva that we're going to be reading from today was published. He published it right away as a pamphlet in the year that he composed it, which was the year 1630. All the way at the end of this tshuva, we like to begin at the end. He writes as follows: Yiratzim milifneim, may it be the will of the people. Which people he's referring to here? He's referring to the leadership of the Jewish community in Venice. Lahasim leiv, lahasir roiv, hacharamas va'ales leimispar, to remove from our community, from the Jewish community, to remove the many haramim and the alais that are innumerable. This is the fact that Jewish communities, they would pass legislation all of the time. You can't do this, you can't do that. And if you do, there is going to be certain bans of excommunication and curses associated with this activity. Says Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh, this is a terrible idea. Because the majority of these rules and regulations, the Jews in the community are not following them. They're violating them all of the time. So what's the problem with that? What's the problem with having rules on the books that people are always violating? So here is how he frames the problem. There isn't a day, a day doesn't go by where there isn't a lot of problems that we suffer because of these curses. And he's going to go on to talk about essentially a spiritual harm that translates in very physical ways. Specifically, the fact that the community places these bans and says if you're going to do it, so there's going to be certain curses, those curses actually end up coming true. And the community is harmed in a very practical way. When suffering comes to the world, it doesn't discriminate between the good and those who aren't good. He goes on to say, Shana Shavra, last year, remember I told you this he composed in 1630, so he's saying in the year 1629, 130 people in the Jewish community in Venice died. That means in 1629 there was some form of a plague that broke out in Venice, and it took many lives. Why is this happening? So he's saying one of the reasons this is happening is because there are all these laws and excommunications associated with curses on the books, but the people aren't following it, and as a result, whether they're tzaddikim or rishoyim, whether they violated it or not, they end up being plagued by the plague. This is beside for the economic problem. He doesn't relate what the economic problem was. But last year, 1629, there was a huge economic crisis in the Jewish community in Venice that also was a result of this. And so I can't be silent anymore. I have to open up the mouth of my pen, meaning I'm taking up my pen. And I had to write this entire tshuva, and he signs off by putting his name, Venice, Tes Adar, Haitian Tzaddik, that's the year 1630, and he says his name is Yehuda Aryeh of Modena. Now, as much as the end over here is a problem with the many different rules and regulations the Jewish community leaders put on the community. The bulk of this tshuva is really about one specific regulation that's really bothering him. And in this tshuva, he goes to specifically target that regulation, and that's how he begins his tshuva. So at the end, he says, there's a lot of these, but really, his focus is on one. What is that one? So for that, let's turn to the beginning of the tshuva, where he writes as follows: She'ela. It's the date is Shvat Heishin Peiches Avar. So in the past Shvat of the year Shin Peiches, which is 1628, B'Kehila Ktoisha Venetia, in the Jewish community of Venice, Noyadu Kolpere Mas, all of the people who pay taxes gathered together. Minyud Beis Dukati Umayla, anyone who paying more than 12 ducats a year, meaning there are those who pay less tax. They weren't part of this meeting. The Rashi Akol Eitziu Askama, and the leaders of the community put out the following legislation, Nikras v'nichteves b'lashon laz, and it was written up in Italian, in Judeo-Italian, Zeh Nuscha, and this is the language. And he goes on to quote it word for word in the Judeo-Italian. We're going to continue reading it in a Hebrew translation. So this is what the legislation said. Because it has now become popular amongst Jews, these various card and games of die, Hagarmim, Churban, V'akiras Mishpachos, and this destroys people and uproots families. Yehei Mesukan, so we're legislating Sheyeh Al Kol Yehudi Adar BeVenetzia, it was forbidden on any Jew living in Venice. Bo'inish Cherem Chomer, a strict Cherem. L'sachek BeVenetzia u'mechutzla, to play whether in Venice or to play outside of Venice. Im Yehudi, whether playing with another Jew, v'im Adam Acher, or playing with a non-Jew. Or to send someone else to play in your behalf. Any of the following games. And it goes on to give the Italian names for 11 games. If you're interested in the history of gaming, you may find interest in actually looking at the names of what those games are and seeing if you can figure out what those are. Umi sheyase, and anyone who does play these games, yiplo olav kol acharama, it's all of these bands of excommunications, shamtois, klalois, and the curses aksuvim b'choik HaKadosh, written in the Torah. V'hu yisparsem b'batei eknesias, and it's going to be publicized in all the shuls of the ghetto b'tor muchram. There's two sides to the cherem. There's always two sides. One side is the spiritual. We're going to utter that certain curses, or we're going to proclaim certain curses in the Torah should befall these individuals, God forbid. And secondly, is social. And that is there's rules about what people are allowed to do with you. Officially, they should not be interacting with you in business. They should not be inviting you to their homes. You're not going to be getting an aliyah in shul. You're maybe not even be allowed in shul, etc., etc., etc. There's two ends to the cherem. There's a sunset clause. It doesn't last forever. This is going to be in place for 6 years. And when are we going to publicize this? When are we going to release it? When we release the next round of what's called sumptuary laws. Sumptuary laws were very common in Jewish communities, and for that matter, they were common in medieval society and even in Renaissance society. And that was the idea that people cannot spend more than a certain amount of money on clothes. Or certain people can't wear certain things. If they put on a function, it can't be too extravagant, etc., etc. Very often it revolved around class. Like if you were part of the nobility, so then you could wear certain clothes. But if you weren't part of the nobility, then you couldn't wear certain clothes. So that's very often in secular society how these sumptuary laws express themselves. But Jewish communities, like the Jewish community of Venice, they would make their own sumptuary laws. And he goes on, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh, at the end of his tshuva, he says there's 3 good reasons why we need these sumptuary laws. Number one, he says that what happens is if the middle class ends up emulating the rich people and starts wearing the types of shoes that the wealthy people have, what's going to happen? The wealthy people are like, I can't look like him, so I'm now going to have to buy a more expensive shoe. So it basically forces the wealthy people to spend more money because the guys in the middle are trying to emulate the wealthy. So we don't want the wealthy people to feel forced that they need to spend more money. And so therefore we tell the people in the middle class, no, you can't spend a certain amount of money. So he thinks this is a great idea for that reason. That's the first reason. However, that's not the more common reason that's given for Jewish sumptuary laws. The more common are the next 2. And that is, it triggers enmity from the non-Jews. When you have a non-Jew who realizes that a Jew has a nice suit and he can't afford it, it could stoke anti-Semitism. And the third thing is, when the government sees, wow, look at the way these Jews are putting on their wedding feasts or whatever it is, then the next time, let's say there's a plague in the community, in Venice in general, and so they raise taxes in order to pay for expenses associated with the plague, they're going to come to the Jewish community. They're for sure going to do it. They're going to say, you need to give us a certain amount of money. All of a sudden, they're like, yeah, and we've been watching the weddings that's been going on the last few years, so instead of it being whatever, it's going to be that much more. And so now it can end up costing the Jewish community. That's the third reason why he says it's good to have the sumptuary laws. What they're saying here is we're going to publicize the ban against gambling next time we release the sumptuary laws, whenever that's going to be. Okay, so that was the text of the legislation. Now it needs to pass, right? And all the people in attendance are the people paying 12 ducats a year. They have the merit to vote. So Valpi solo ubaluti. So baluti, that's the easy word. That's ballot. Ballot means a ball. The English word, a ballot for voting, comes from the Italian word baluti. So they're casting their ballot. Busulu is some sort of wood that was used as some sort of chip or whatever it is to vote. So they cast their ballots, and Amdu Laminion, they voted, Vinishara, and the result was Alpi Ayin, Hey, Hain, 75 voted yes, Chaf Tes Lav, 29 said nay, so you had 104 total votes. Later in the tshuva, he says that the number of Balabatim living in the Jewish community in Venice in the year 1628 was 600. So you had 600 people, some of whom were paying less than 12 ducats a year taxes, some paying no tax because they were too poor. But there was 600. But those 600, they're not voting. They don't have a say because they're not paying enough taxes. It's the people who you have to pay to play. So it's the people who are paying the 12 ducats. It's 104 of them. They're the ones that vote. This becomes legislation. And as we already know from the end of the tshuva, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena says, no one's listening. No one's listening. You pass that legislation, but people are breaking this law, as many others, and a bulk of his tshuva is against this legislation that the community enacted at that time. Now, in order to walk into this dispute and understand where's the community coming from, where's the rabbi coming from, and all that, I want to go back a few years to 1595. Because in the year 1595, there was a sefer that was printed in Venice under the title Sur Meira. It came out as an anonymous work. So right now, for the next few minutes, we don't know who wrote this work. Again, I said published in Venice in 1595. It's published as a debate or as a dialogue, which was common in Renaissance Italy and also amongst Jewish Mechabrim, 1600s and 1700s as well. We have Mechabrim wrote Svarim in that way. So, for example, one version of the Mesilas Yesharim of Ramchal, composed in Italy, is written as a dialogue. There's a sefer called Kuzri Sheni, otherwise known as Matei Dan, that has origins in a rabbi who's from Italy, a Makubal, Rabbi Yosef Irgas, who wrote Shomer Amunim, also in the 1700s, also written in this way of a dialogue. So Sur Meira fits that genre, written as a dialogue. The two proponents, or the two heroes of this dialogue, are Eldad and Medad. He's borrowing names from Parshas Ba'aloischa, and they're the ones who are talking with each other. And what is the conversation about? The conversation in this, it's a very small book. The conversation is all about gambling. So Eldad basically discovers that his friend Medad is a gambler. And so Eldad is having a conversation trying to convince Medad out of gambling. So in chapter 3 of this Sefer Sur Meira, Eldad is quoted by saying, "Hamatzachek oiver al kol aseres hadibros." So we're coming to Shavuos. He says, the person who is the metzachek, the gambler, he violates all of the 10 commandments. Why? So he says like this, Anochi v'lo yeh lecha is about worshiping one God. Well, what happens is, he says, gamblers, when they lose, they become mad. And when you become mad, the Gemara says, Kol hakoyes ki lo eved avodah zarah. So that's a me'ain, that's idolatry in miniature. What about swearing falsely? He says people who gamble, they're swearing falsely all the time. Thousands of Shavuos. Okay. Shabbos, what's going to happen if you're gambling and it's Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashas and you're like, if only you play a little more, I'm going to win. So now you reached Chilul Shabbos. Kibud Aveim, well, the parents are going to speak to you. They're going to say, you got to stop this, and you're not going to listen. You're going to respond disrespectfully, and you're going to make your parents' life really, really miserable. Then he goes further and says, and when you realize you lost all your money, you're going to become mad, you're going to become jealous, it's going to lead to hate, and one thing will lead to the next, and you're going to give a sword to someone, and God forbid, violate lo yitzirtzach. What about lo sinaf? Well, he says the gambling scene is one of where there's bein nashim yis'arav. It's not a modest scene. There's a lot of intermingling that goes on. And also, it's very common for people to speak profanity that is in one way or another associated with lo sinaf. Lo signif, when you lost your money, you're going to go ahead, you're going to steal in order to gamble. He said something about testifying falsely. I didn't fully understand what he said, but believe me, he said you're going to end up violating that too. And then he says, and obviously the last one, definitely jealousy is a major issue as it relates to gambling. And so the bottom line is, Elda turns to his friend Medad and says, this is really bad. It violates each of the 10 commandments. Now Medad is not convinced, and Medad starts arguing back. I'm not going to give you what Medad's arguments are back, but that's the theme of chapter 3 of the Sefer Sur Meirah. The fourth chapter of the Sefer Sur Meirah turns to the real halacha, because this is a real sugya in halacha. It involves a Mishnah, it involves Gemara, it involves Poskim. It's a huge sugya. And part of this, and the fourth chapter of this Sefer addresses this. So let's go to the sugya and actually look at these sources. Mishnah Sanhedrin Perek Gimel says as follows. Ve'elu hein apsulim. Here are the people who are disqualified from being a witness in a Jewish court of law. They are, and it gives a list. The first person on the list is Hamasachik Bekuvya. Kuvya is a die. The person who plays, who gambles essentially, is Pasal Eidus. So the Gemara immediately asks, Frek the Gemara, Mesachik Bekuvya Maika Ovid, what's so problematic about gambling? Amar Rami Bar Chama, so we have a Machloikas Amaroim. Amar Rami Bar Chama says, Meshum Dahava Asmachta, because it's the problem of Asmachta. V'Asmachta loy kanya, and Asmachta doesn't work. More on that in a second. Rav Sheshas Amar, Rav Sheshas immediately disagrees and says, Kol ki agavna lav asmachti. This gambling is not Asmachta. So what's an Asmachta, and what's this debate whether gambling involves a problem of Asmachta or not? So let's go to the Gemara and Bava Metzia Daf Kutala and Amid Beis. The Gemara deals with the following case over there. Hahu Gavra, the Kibel Ara Mechavrei. There's a person who received land from a colleague. Now, when it says he received land, this is a financial arrangement where it's your land. I am going to work it. I'm going to till it. I'll do all the work. So you're the owner. I do the work. And let's say we'll split whatever the arrangement is. I'll get a certain part of the yield. You'll get a certain part of the yield. Now, remember, for you to do that with me, it's risky, because what happens if I don't show up? If I don't show up, then you get nothing. So you actually have to really trust me that I'm going to show up and do the work, so that you get your end, so you get your profit. Now, what happened is, in the conversation, Amar, the worker, says, "I muvarnala, if I leave it fallow, if I don't work the field, Yalvinalach alpha zuzi. I'm going to give you 1,000 zuzim. Now, 1,000 zuzim, that's a huge amount of money, way more than the loss would be for not tilling the field. But he really wants to make a point. I am so going to work this field. I'm going to do such a good job. And if you catch me being lazy, and I don't end up tilling this field, and I don't end up working this field, I'm going to give you 1,000 zuzim. That was the story. What happened? Oiver tilsa. He let a third of it remain fallow. He worked 2/3 of the field. 1/3 he didn't. I don't know. Maybe he went gambling. I don't know what happened. He didn't end up doing the third. So the shaila was, what's the din now? Does he need to give 1/3 of 1,000 zuzim for that third that he didn't do? Rava Amar. So Rava says, nope. Asmachta it's an asmachta. When he said, I'm going to give you 1,000, usually it's like a deal is a deal, right? It's a commitment. No. This is a case where no deal. What is it? Asmachta. What does the word asmachta mean? He's relying. He's relying on what? He's relying on the fact that of course he's going to till the field. Of course he's going to work the field. So in other words, when does a commitment on halacha become binding? You need gemiras das. Das means that I 100% in my brain commit that I'm going to give you a certain amount of money. Here you don't have gemiras das. Why? Because when he says he's going to give 1,000 zuzim, what's he thinking in his mind? It's never going to happen. Of course I'm going to work. What's going to stop me from showing up and doing work? So in his mind, as much as he says, I'm going to give 1,000, in his mind it's like, it's never going to happen. So he never truly resolved to give 1,000. So therefore it's an asmachta like kanya, it's not binding. Rashi in Sanhedrin explains this concept of the asmachta. Rashi says, why is it on asmachta that's loikanya? The savur, because the person says, it's in my hands. I'm going to choose, I'm going to determine whether I show up to work or not. So Meresha Kimasni, so therefore at the beginning when he makes the condition, it's assuming that he's not going to have to give that asmachta money. That's why he's making the condition. The toy of his savor, he makes a mistake and he thinks, it's never going to happen. So that's what an asmachta is. Rami Bar Chama argues the same thing as with gambling. A person says that if the die lands on a 1, I'm going to give you this amount of money. What's he thinking in his head? He's thinking in his head, but it's not going to land on that. It's only a 1 in 6 chance. So he's relying on the not. So he never really gave full gemiras das. He never really committed to giving over the money. And that's the problem of playing the game. When you're playing the game, by taking it, you're essentially taking money that the guy never really committed al pi Torah to give to you. And so therefore, it has a din of gezel. If it has a din of gezel, so you can't be a witness because a witness can't be a rasha. And last I checked, the person who is a gazlan is a rasha, and so therefore you're not allowed to. You can't be a aid. However, we know that Rav Sheshes disagreed with all of this. What did Rav Sheshes say? Rav Sheshes said, no, this is not an asmachta. Why? So Rashi continues and says, Aval hacha. Here's Rav Sheshes' voice. Rav Sheshes says, in this case, this is not an asmachta. Lo samich hamidi. He's not relying on the fact that, for sure I'm going to win. He has no way of knowing if he's going to win or not. I could say, of course I'm going to show up to work every day. That's a reasonable thing that people could tell themselves. What's stopping me from showing? Of course, some random crazy accident could happen. But Papashas, I'm going to show up to work every day and I'm going to work the field. You can't say that when you're playing a game. When you're gambling, what are you going to say? I'm for sure going to win? You know that it's not in your hands. And nonetheless, you sat down and you said, this is a real game, and you're going to keep the money, and it's all that. So therefore, Gamar Va'akani, you really made up your mind. And you really made up your mind. So you do a Gemiras Das. You fully committed to give the guy the money. So when you give the winner the money, Lav Zelahi, it's not Zela. And so therefore, Rav Sheshes disagrees and says, this is not an asmakta. So what do you have here? You have here, Machloikas Amaroim, is it an asmakta or not? But let's remember, the Mishnah clearly said that you're disqualified from being a witness. You can't argue with the Mishnah. The Mishnah clearly said that you're disqualified from being the witness. According to Rami Bar Chama, we know why. You're essentially stealing. Gambling is essentially stealing because of the lack of a real commitment by the loser. All right, but what about Rav Sheshes? So the Gemara continues. The Gemara says, Ella, Rav Sheshes gives you another reason why gambling is a problem. Because they're not involved in normal human activity that's good for society. Now, what happens immediately is we say, so why does that equal being pasal eidos? I understand why if I'm a sinner, I'm pasal eidos. But if you tell me I'm wasting time, that I'm not involved in something productive, point well taken, I'm not involved in something productive, I understand that, but why does that mean I'm pasal eidos? So the Rishonim discuss it, Rashi discusses it. The Meiri has nice oisius, where the Meiri says as follows. Meiri says that you're involved in a area of life where lying is very common. And in fact, it's almost expected. Though people who do this, like gambling, it's very, very normal. So you have that mindset, and then you walk into a court of law, and then it's a whole different zone. Here, like, you can't lie. Here, right? So if you're involved in normal trades, and you're involved in normal areas of life, so you understand that. You walk into the courtroom, you're not going to lie. Here, I can't call you a Russia, but what I could say is, your brain, about the way you talk about yes and no, the way you talk about truth, it's like a different frame of reference. We're not comfortable having that in the courtroom because and that's why you're pasal eidos. So the Gemara, as it often does, now that we have a machloikas, two different reasons for why you're pasal eidos. One, because of gezel and rishus, because gambling is not a real kinyan on the part of the loser, and the other is because of we think that you're not gonna speak truth. So what's the difference? My benayu. There is a difference. Is there a difference? Ika benayu and for the Gemara, there is a difference. The Gemara umnus achrisi. If he's trained in another umnus, if you're trained in another trade. So according to the first, let's think this through. According to Rami Bar Chama, let's say I have another job. This person is an accountant. Let's say he's a person, an accountant. He works really, really hard, and he's very, very good at his business. Everyone loves him, and he's honest. He's a very, very honest accountant. But he's also doing this gambling. According to Rami Bar Chama, he's a ganiv. I don't care. He gambles $1 a day. He's a ganiv. So he's a ganiv. So you pass eidos. But according to Rav Sheshes, what's the whole problem? The problem was that his framework of truth and false is warped. No, it's not. He's an accountant. He also gambles on the side. So he knows, just like he knows in his accounting business, as avart is avart, you can't mess around. When he walks into the courtroom, he's going to know to talk from his accounting side of his brain, not to talk from his gambling side of his brain. And so therefore, there is a very, very practical difference between the two. Now, if we stopped here and we'd say, okay, we learned the sugya, we saw the machloikas, is gambling mutter or not? What would end up? We'd say, well, it sounds like it's a machloikas. According to the second position, according to Rav Sheshes, it's mutter. You may disqualify yourself from being a witness, but okay, maybe that's worth the price to pay. So I won't be a witness because even that is only if you're doing it full time. So I may disqualify from being myself a witness if I do it full time. Even that wouldn't be a problem if I have a normal job. But either way, it's not usher. According to Rami Bar Chama, it would be usher. So then what's the next step in this analysis? The next step in this analysis is to say, so how do the Rishonim paskin? Do the Rishonim paskin like Rami Bar Chama, that it's gzeila? Or do they paskin like Rav Sheshes, that it's not gzeila? So that brings us to the Rishonim. So in this work, what happens is that Eldad, remember Eldad is against the gambling, Eldad starts bringing Rishonim that basically tell us that the takeaway from the sugya should be that it's gezel and therefore prohibited. That's what Eldad is telling his friend. So who does he quote? He quotes the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Gzeila V'Aveda. This was recently in the Parak Echad cycle, where it says as follows. Hamasachkim Bekuvya, says the Rambam, is a gezel midivreim. This is rabbinic gezel. Okay, that's a good point of clarification. This is not gezel midaraisa. At the end of the day, even according to the stricter position, we're not assuming that this is like literal gezel, like your theft. It's a level of gezel that's only gezel midarabanan. Even though the guy consented to give you the money, because you took it without consideration, which means you didn't give him anything in return, and it was in a gaming fashion, gezel, that's why it's gezel. Okay, in one way, a very strong way, this sounds a lot like Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama said it's an issue of gezel, and that's what it sounds like here. It's an issue of gezel. The thing is, and a lot of people have discussed this, and we're not going to go too far into this. The Rambam's language is a little different than the Gemara. The Rambam doesn't say it's an asmachta, which means the giver didn't really want to give it. To the contrary, the Rambam says ratzon habaylim. The giver wanted to give it. Rambam says because you took it without consideration. Usually, when you buy something in the store. So you took a bottle of water, so you gave the guy $1, or the other way around. So that's what's considered. Usually you gave something to get something. Here, the very fact that you got something without giving anything, that in and of itself renders it gezel. That's not the same language as saying, the guy, when he made up, he's going to give you the money, he assumed he was going to win, and so therefore he never had given it. The Rambam doesn't use that language. So a lot of the commentaries get involved, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, what does the Rambam do? The Rambam tells us, if it's not mamish Rami Bar Chama, it's very close to Rami Bar Chama. We have an issue of gezel here. The Rambam continues and then says, "V'amasachek bekuvya im hagoy." If it's a non-Jew, anybody is gezel. There's no problem with gezel. Why? Because remember, it's not gezel midaraisa. That's not typical gezel. On the face of it, there's no problem. You made a deal with someone. You said, if I win, this is going to happen. If you win, this is what's going to happen. It's not gezel. The Chachamim said that we want to ban it as gezel. Okay, so where did the Chachamim make that gzeira? Where did the Chachamim make that ban? They enacted that ban between Jews. They didn't enact that ban if it's with a Gentile. However, even if it's a Gentile, yesh ba yisr oisek b'dvarim b'teilim, there's still a different prohibition. The prohibition is that you're doing nothing. That you're oisek b'dvarim b'teilim. And all of one's life, a person should be involved in divrei chachma yeshuva shaloylam, and so therefore you shouldn't be involved in gambling, even if it isn't a gezel problem, because it is a dvarim b'teilim type of problem. So Eldad brings this and says, look, I know you have a machlokes in the Gemara, you could say it cuts two ways, but which way is halacha? And the Rambam is clearly telling you something is gezel midivreim. We should not be involved in gezel midivreim. You got to cut your gambling habit. Then he brings another edition. This edition is an Rashba. The Rashba was asked a question that, by the way, appears very often in Shalos HaTshuvos. Many, many times. The question goes like this. A person was gambling. So what do? They want to stop their habit from gambling. They make a shvur, they make a neder, and now that's going to keep them away. Now they feel like their willpower is breaking, and any day they're going to cave, and they're going to end up gambling. So what's going to happen? Now if they gamble, number one, there's the problem with gambling. But number two, in addition to that, now they're violating the shvur or neder, which is a very, very serious sin. So what's the solution? Say, this is the interesting shaila. You knock on the door of the Rav, and you say, can we do ataras nadar? I want to do ataras nadar. Now there's certain conditions in halacha where you could essentially revoke the vow. So think about it. The shaila, revoke the vow, why? So that if I gamble, I don't violate the serious vow. So you can understand the merit in that. On the other hand, it's a little bizarre because essentially you're asking for a vow to be revoked to engage in, let's just call it right now, questionable activity. So this is the shaila that comes to the Rabbanim. The Rashba gets a shaila. What's his answer? Mistabra de'ein is kakin loy. Do not be matir his neder. Why? Sheschoik bekuvya avera, because it's a sin. And we're not matir a neder to enable someone to sin. And we don't say, well, come on, that's only gezel midivrayim, right? Gambling, worst case scenario, is gezel midivrayim. But a neder is like Isam in HaTorah. But if you're not going to allow him to violate his vow, if you're not going to revoke his vow, he's going to be over a Isser Chomer, Isser Shotayr, and it doesn't matter. We don't do that. We don't say that enable the guy to do a small Aveira in order to help him do a big Aveira. And so what is Eldad doing here? Eldad is doing and saying, look, the Rashba, another one of the great Rishonim, says that it's Aser. He calls it an Aveira. It's an Aveira Ktana, but he still calls it an Aveira. But Pashtus, Rashba doesn't say what is the nature of the Aveira. But to keep it simple, we'll say he agrees with Rami Bar Chama or the Rambam. It's some form of Gezel, and that's why it's prohibited. So this is what Eldad tells his friend. Now remember, it's a dialogue, so Meidad is going to respond back. Meidad is going to want to say, hold on, that's not a good conclusion in halacha. But before he does that, I want to show you the following piece, because it also shows you something I failed to say before, and that is there's elements of satire in this work, Sur Meirah. There's elements of satire, and you have that over here. His response is, if you're right that the gambler is puzzled to be a judge and is puzzled to be a witness, guess what? He's in great company. Why? Because a melech is not allowed to give eidos. So he's like a melech. A king is not allowed to give eidos. And in terms of din, it says in Pirkei Avos, in terms of that he can't preside over a court case, it says in Pirkei Avos, it praises the person who's choisech atzmai min adin, the person who avoids being a rav on a din Torah. The commentaries explain it's, for example, if there's someone else in town who's better than you who could do it, or if instead of being an arbitrator in a din Torah, but to bring people together, so you're mediating. So if you do that, you avoid Ava and hate and all types of problems. So he's like, okay, so now I can't be a Dayan. Great, so I'm being Mekayim, what it says in that Mishnah, that I avoid all the problems associated with being a judge. Good, so that's the satire element here, but then he goes on to say, the truth is, you're saying that it's theft, and that's why we're disqualified from witnesses. It's not true. It's nothing to do with theft. And the disqualification for witnesses is for a different reason. And he quotes the Rif. The Rif is a very important Rishon in order to get to the bottom of how the Rishonim understand this sugya. And the Rif on the sugya says as follows: remember, the Rif style is he's truncating the Gemara. He uses the language of the Gemara, just removing the shakl v'tarya and extra opinions and going straight to the halacha. So the Rif here is quoted as saying, what's so bad with gambling? Rami Bar Chama's position of asmachta, his position of gezel, is completely missing here. It just goes straight to say, Rav Shesha says, because you're not involved in Yeshuva Shalaylam, which, as we explained before, that means you're a little more prone to lie, so we can't have you in a courtroom, so that's why you're not kosher leidus. Well, what do you see from here? You see from here there's no element of gezel, there's no element of isser, for that matter. We wouldn't say anything of this sort. He goes further and says, in addition, I want to show you a commentary on the Rif. known as the Shilta Giborim. Shilta Giborim was authored in the prior century, meaning we're in the 1600s now. So in the prior century, in the 1500s, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Boyaz, and he lived in Italy as well. And Rabbi Yehuda Boyaz deals with a problem. And until now, it was either or. We had two paths, and now a third path is going to emerge. And this third path is going to come from the Shilta Giborim. The two paths we had till now is one, gambling is completely mutter, just under certain conditions you're not going to be able to testify. Or it's gezel midivrayim, and therefore a real serious prohibition that we need to avoid. Okay, those are essentially the two paths. However, Rabbi Yehuda Boyaz analyzes some of the Rishonim that preceded him, and he notices contradictions in their rulings. Where in some places it sounds like they're ruling there is a problem of gezel, and in some places that there isn't. Or another way of saying it, sometimes it sounds like they're following Rami Bar Chama, and sometimes they're following Rav Sheshes. And he's very bothered by that, and he's trying to make sense out of the fact that the Torah and other earlier sources would have these inner contradictions. What does he do? He says as follows. There are indeed times where we say there is theft. You want to know when that is? When you play with the idea of, if you win, I'll give you $100. When? Tomorrow, I'll go to the bank account. After I lose, tomorrow I'll go to the bank and I'll get it for you. The money you didn't put down on the board right now. You didn't put the money into the pile. That's a case where there's asmachta, vada aliba de koliyama. Here, it makes a lot of sense to say Rav Sheshes is right. Here, you're like, because the money is not here, you can't touch it, you're not seeing it, you didn't give it away yet. So in your mind, it's like, I'm going to win. But if you took the money out of your pocket already and you put it down on the board, then there's gemiras das, like the money already left my pocket. This is really, really serious. Then you're consenting to lose. This is the distinction that Shilta Giborim makes. Again, he does this because that helps us explain why there would seem to be some contradictions amongst the Rishonim. So what is internally amongst certain Rishonim? So Meidad's points, essentially two things. Number one, we don't paskin like the stricter view. We paskin like the lenient view. And even if we are going to be paskin like the stricter view, it's only in a very narrow condition if we're not putting the money on the board. But Meidad continues his point and says, "Be'emes is it's a eitza toiva." All of the gamblers know that it's not good to gamble on credit without having the money. It's got to be in front of you. That's generally how we do it. So what's the problem? We're in good shape, and so therefore your analysis is wrong. You started telling me that it's usher because of the Rambam and the Rashba. I'm not answering you about the Rambam, and I'm not answering you about the Rashba. What I am telling you is I have additional sources that are important, including ones that would limit perhaps what the Rambam and the Rashba said to very narrow circumstances of doing it ba'amana, not when you put money down. And so therefore, he says it's going to be mutter. He goes for, now before I go to the next part, I want to just, derech agav, when you're learning this shtickle in the Sefer Sur Meirah, you notice something very interesting. At no point does he ever quote the Rami Bar Chama. He doesn't mention the name Rami Bar Chama, and the words Rami Bar Chama said he doesn't mention. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on over there. And I realize his quotes of the Gemara are always direct quotes from the Rif. And then I further realized that he never quotes Tosfos in his analysis. He's quoting the Shilta Giborim and the Nemukei Yosef commentaries that are on the side of the page of the Rif. And basically, slowly it dawned upon me, let's remember the time and place. This book, as I said, came out in 1595 in Venice. We spoke about this previous times, the Gemara was burnt. It was confiscated, when was it? In the 1550s, I recall, in Rome. And there were very severe limitations on having Gemaras in Italy, including in Venice. And we know this from other places, people who didn't have Gemara. But we know that the Rif was not banned. There were Rifs printed in 1553, like a year after the burnings of the Gemara. And this is a good example. He didn't have the Gemara. So he didn't have Rami Bar Chama. When you read, both what Eldad is saying and what Meidad is very, very clear. He's just figuring everything out through the Rif without having access to it's just wild, without having the Gemara with him. Okay, Meidad continues, and Meidad says, now he's going to go on the offensive. You're telling me the whole time, till now I'm defending gambling. right? Now let me go on the attack and actually show why gambling is great. So Meidad says in chapter 4, I'll tell you what's good about gambling. Firstly, that's how you learn about people. You learn about their midos, their good midos, their bad midos. You learn who's talkative, who's quick to anger. Then he says, here, I'll tell you another nice thing about gambling. The person learns to get used to the uncertainties of life. And when suddenly a huge expense comes and he's like, oh my God, I have to spend all this money, he's not worried about it because he's used to like losing huge chunks of money at a time. He also is used to the idea that nothing is eternal. You know, other than Hashem, nothing is eternal. And side perk, he also picks up math without having to pay for a tutor. And so this is a small sample of the benefits of gambling. And he says like this, Soif Davar, the person who plays cards and die, he quotes a pasuk, Yodei bakel v'yad kol boy. Yodei bakel v'yad kol boy. Now, what he's using this pasuk is to say, he has everything. He has all the benefits. And now he makes a gematria. Bakoil is gematria 52. How many cards are there in a deck of cards? 52 cards. And v'yad kol boy. V'yad is gematria 20. Im hamilo, with the word, is 21. How many dots are there on a die? There's 21 dots on a die, and on a dice. And so therefore, that's the remez. If you have the dice and you have your deck of cards, Yada Bakol V'Yad Kol Boy, you have all the benefits. Remember, there's elements of satire here, but fine. So this is his point here. At the end, come to chapter 6 of this work. This is the final chapter. Finally, Meidad says, okay, I was pulling your leg. He says, I know. This is a bad habit. Now, he doesn't take away the fact that he thinks halachically his arguments were sound, that it's not usher. But he says, I was saying that it's great. I'll be honest with you. It's not good. Mahusai hevel v'ra'a rabba. It's nothingness and just evil. And he says, human beings, what do we want? Ultimately, we want three things. We want to have a healthy body, we want to have wealth, and we want to have a happy spirit. And he says, I've seen in life that the person who gambles doesn't have either of the three. And then he makes the following point. If in the earlier years the Jewish people would have been prone to gamble the way they are today, so he's saying 1595 that there is a tendency to gamble. Obviously, it goes without saying, this work would have been of zero interest to people if people weren't gambling. If there would have been as prone to gamble then as today, then firstly, Chazal would have banned it in the days of the Sanhedrin. But the truth is, then he goes, even God already would have banned it. The 10 Commandments would have been, Loi sirtzach, Loi sinov, Loi signov, Loi titzchoik, don't gamble. But Jews simply in those days didn't do it, and so therefore, that's why it wasn't there. This is the conclusion of the book. It's a very good indicator of what the situation was in Venice going on at the time in 1595. And now let's go back to the year 1630 when Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Modena says 2 years ago the Jewish Kehillah in Venice banned gambling, and we already know he doesn't like it, and he thinks the fact that people are violating the rules anyway, which is happening, is a problem, because then negative things are happening to the Jewish community. So let's go back to the beginning of the tshuva to see his arguments against this legislation. He writes, anyone who's going to want to support this community legislation, they're going to say as follows, according to the poskim, it's forbidden. Umuskam, once you acknowledge that, then it automatically follows. It's well known that Yecholim Roi Vakol, that the majority of a community could force the miut, Bechol Davar Roi Leifrushim Yisura. Anything that's about distancing from sin, you can have a majority of people voting, and even though some people don't consent, doesn't matter. This is about kashrus, this is about tznius, this is about Shabbos, this is about an important halacha. So even if some people don't like the rules, we can force it on them. So that's the justification is going to be that it's usher, and therefore the community has this right to legislate morality. Says Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh, Ani Oimer, I want to say that the Rambam and the Rashba and any other source that you're going to pull out to forbid gambling, I saw all these sources when I was 13 years old. Sha'oz chibarti maimer sur meira ala tzchoik. I then authored the book, the anonymous book, Sur Meira. I authored it when I was 13 years old. It was printed later in Venice 35 years ago. Remember, he's writing in 1630. 35 years before is 1595. The book was printed in 1595. But he's telling you that it wasn't written in 1595. He's telling you that he wrote it actually earlier, much earlier. In fact, when he was 13 years old. I'm going to come back to that claim a little later on. So he says, I know all this Isser stuff already. But guess what? I already brought then the Shulti Gebarim. Remember what the Shulti Gebarim said? The Shulti Gebarim said that if there's money, you're putting down the money on the table, so then it's not a problem, it's not an asmachta, it's definitely not gezel, and you're not going to have that problem. He says now, I want to add to that. Sources that he didn't bring then, either he didn't have access or he didn't know, but he's bringing these sources now. The Rama, he brings the Rama in Choshen Mishpat. The Rama writes in Siman Shin Ayin, Kfar Pashat Haminik Kisfara Achroina Lischok Bekuvya. Look at these words. It is already common for people to play and to gamble. Now, when he says minig here, he doesn't mean minig in the sense of something sanctified, that minig Yisrael Torah, obviously. What he means is that it's common for Jews to do this. And you're not disqualified as a witness unless you have no other job. Why? Because how do we paskin? What's Ramah saying here? We paskin like the second view, Rav Sheshes. There is no gezel problem. The only problem is, do you have a erroneous framework of truth and lies? Well, if you have another job, we're not concerned about that, as we spoke about earlier. And so the Ramah says that this is generally how we view this, where there isn't a prohibition. However, the Ramah concludes there and says, but see what we wrote in Siman Reish Zayin. What does Ramah write in Siman Reish Zayin? Reish Zayin is where the Shulchan Aruch discusses the laws of Asmachta. Says the Ramah, if the money is put on the table, mutar lischok, it's permitted, ve'ein by asmachta. Unlike the people who say it's always prohibited. So is there a view that says it's always prohibited? Yeah. Is there a view that says even if you put it on the table, it's prohibited? Yeah. You have that stricter view. But the Ramah is saying it's common for this to be done, and it's mutar. But by telling us to look at Reish Zayin, he seems to be saying, but it's only mutter the way the Shulta Gibarim told us it's mutter. It's only mutter if you're putting the money down in advance, because then we know you really, really made peace with the fact that you're giving away this money, which means that the other person takes it. It isn't a gezel. Says Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh. So we have Shnei Ma'iris Gdolim Achroinim. We have two of the great Ma'iris. He means here two. He is number one, the Ramah. Secondly, I didn't quote here, he brings from the Lavush. The Lavush, Ramard Chayafi, who passed away in the early 1600s, so he also paskins the same way like the Ramah. And there, they matter more than the Rashba. And they matter more than the Rambam. And for that matter, they matter more than Rabbi Yosef Karo, who also has a stricter position on these matters. Why? Because in Ashkenaz and Italy, who do we follow? We're always following these poskim, the Ramah and the Lavush, and they're matirim behedya lischoik, and they're matir playing, gambling. If so, I remove the premise to allow this moral legislation. The moral legislation is only justified if there's Isser, but ain't by Migdar Milsa. But there isn't, because it's mutter. So, this is a very hard argument, because at the end of the day, it's a machlokes. At the end of the day, you have many, many good poskim that say that it's prohibited. And so even if you have some that say it's mutter, fine. You want to get into a conversation, is it mutter or usser, you could say, I rely more on one poskim or another. But we're talking here about morality legislation. And there are limits to communities, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. When could a community pass laws? Like, how does that work? Like, why all of a sudden a group of people got together and they decided, I can't do something? We all take that as a given, but why does that work? And under what rubric does it work? So, one of them is for morality, which means in Torah, for halacha. Why can't they say, there's a machlokas, but that other view is a strong view, So it means they're not going to have the right to make that legislation? I think that's a very, very hard argument. But he wants to say that it's mamish like eating a tuna sandwich. There's no issue whatsoever. So then you can't use that justification for the ban. Then he goes further and says, and let's put this argument aside. And let's say gambling's tak usher like the Rashba said and the Rambam said. I have a problem. My problem is you only banned 11 games. You may think that that's all the games. It's not. There's more games, and they didn't ban those other games. And he mentions what those other games are, and they didn't ban them. Why? If there's an isser, there's no nafkamina between them. In fact, there's a greater isser in the ones they didn't ban. Why? So he says there's basically two types of gambling games. There's probably more, but for our purpose of our conversation, there's two types. Some that are 100% luck, and some that involve some element of skill and wisdom. Which one is a bigger problem in terms of an asmachta? Think about it. Which one's a bigger problem? The one that involves skill. Why? Because then a guy sits down at the table who's like, I'm so skilled, I'm so smart, I rely on myself, I'm never going to have to give up the $100. And then what happens? He gives up the $100, so he didn't have Gemiras Das. If it's 100% luck, so then you're sitting down and saying, I'm for sure going to win? How could you say you're for sure going to win? It's 100% luck. It happens to be the games that they banned, some of the games they banned is 100% luck. Some of the games they allowed was the ones that involved skill. That's a bigger halachic problem. So this is 2 points. One, they should have banned all, because if you want to follow the Rambam and the Rashba, you have to ban all of them. And two, if for whatever reason you have a justification to ban some, the ones you should be banning are the ones that involve skill. The more luck that's involved, those should be more acceptable. So these are some of the problems he's having with the legislation. He goes on in another shtickle to say there's another point. That is that we saw in the din, the halacha, even the Rambam, who was the stricter position, said there's no issue of gezel when it comes to a non-Jew. Remember, it's a takana d'Rabbanan, and they could choose when they're putting it on or off. So it's not on, but their legislation in Venice said this is usher, Jew, and non-Jew. So again, if you're coming from the perspective of we're invoking halacha, and that's the justification, what halacha are you invoking? You don't really have halacha there, if it's non-Jew. Moreover, he says, telling us that we can't gamble against non-Jews is the gather of a takana she'ein roiv hatzibur yichol lama, but people can literally cannot keep it. If you say don't, he doesn't make this argument amongst Jews. To say Jews amongst themselves shouldn't gamble, you could say that. He doesn't, at no point does he say people can't abide by it. He says people aren't, but he doesn't say people can't abide by it. But when it comes to non-Jews, he says people can't abide by it. Why? Because first of all, people are mis'ava litzchok. They want to play, they want to gamble. Not for pleasure, but simply they want to earn money. It's a way of earning income. And it's in this city, in Venice, it's important. Because after Elias im ha'akum shetzoichakim, alfei zav mikol ayaris Italia. Venice is the Vegas of Italy. People are bringing money from all different cities to gamble over here. So it's a great opportunity. You're going to sit by and watch that train leave the station. You're missing an economic opportunity. That's too hard. And then he says, another thing is business. You're doing business with a Jew. We have regular business partnerships and relationships with non-Jews who gamble. So we need to do business with them. And it ends up being we're in a casino. He writes, Beis Vad HaTzoik. I guess it's some sort of casino. You go to their homes. So you want to close a business deal. So just like in some places you close a deal over a beer. So here they close a deal over a good gambling game. And it's almost like they force us. So you can't. So therefore it's even a Sanhedrin can't impose such laws. So how much more so a little kehila in Venice? You don't have the right to pass this legislation. This is the main nekuda of his tshuva. Therefore, trying to say the whole thing is invalid, should have never been passed, and now it should be revoked. They should revoke it. And as we saw at the end, he said the fact that people are violating it causes all these problems in the community with these punishments that are happening. And along the way he said, and there's other laws theoretically that also should come off the books because it's part of the same problem. Now there's another big part of the tshuva that we're not going to spend time on. and where he says, so I knocked out, he feels that he knocked out the avenue of morality, halachic legislation that would allow some people to impose their will on others. But there's another. Communities have economic rights to make economic legislation, nothing to do with halacha. The classic example, the Gemara in Baba Basra says, the people in the community to get together and say, you're not allowed to pay a laborer more than $4 an hour, or whatever it is. And what if one guy disagrees? Too bad. The majority could vote this. So that's called economic policy, nothing to do with morality, the economy. So maybe they're doing this under their economic hat, not under their religious hat. In which case, then there's also permission, which he goes on to say would explain why they ban certain games and not the others. Because halachically, he pointed out, actually doesn't make so much sense, the cheshbon. But economically, it does make sense. Why? Because the games they banned were the games that have the greatest risk. Whereas the ones that have lesser risk, less of an economic impact, less of a social impact on the community, they didn't ban. So he says, okay, fine. You're saying that's the right, so they have a right to do it under that category? So we're not going to go into it. He says, no, they don't have a right to do it. 2 points. Number one, he says, the halacha is that type of legislation, you need to have askama from a rav. They didn't get askama from any of the rabbanim. The community leaders did this on their own without any askama, any official askama from any of the rabbanim. Number one. Number two, he says, if that's what you're doing, you can't just bring the people paying 12 ducats a year and have them vote. If that's what you're doing, you need to have all of the 600 people involved in the voting. Again, there's halachic sources. This gets really into the sugya of how do communities, what are they allowed to do and not allowed to do, and the procedure. He feels that this is the case. I'm just summarizing his arguments bekitzer, and that's a summary of this tshuva. Okay, now here's the last part of this story. The last part of the story is that in 1911, an autobiography was published for the first time by Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena. Now this is fascinating because how many rabbis, and definitely rabbis from that period, wrote autobiographies? Very, very uncommon. And in that way, this work really stands out as an amazing piece of literature, something that's very interesting to read. The Chida in the 1700s saw the manuscript of this autobiography, and he noted it under the entry of Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena. And the Chida writes as follows: Shekoisev Sham, he writes there, Kol ha'oiver olav b'mei chayav, everything that happened in life, hein l'toiv, v'hein l'mutiv, both for the good and the opposite of good. In other words, the Chida is telling you that if you read this autobiography, you're going to see some things over there that aren't so splendid. Let's have a look and read some of the entries from this autobiography. Yimei Chanukah, Hey Shin Nun Hey. It's a fascinating read, by the way, this, and it's been translated into English. Yimei Chanukah, Hey Shin Nun Hey, that's the year 1595. Tzchoik Asali HaSatan, so Satan caused me to gamble. Asher hizikli loy ma'at, which caused me a lot of damage. Ki avadti neged mea dukati. I lost to my opponent, I lost 100 ducats. Here we're learning, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena, this is the first place in his diary where he writes that he gambled and it caused him a lot of harm. What year is he saying he gambled? 1595. What's special about the year 1595 in our story? That's the year he printed the Sefer. I don't know. You want me to believe that he had that book written as a 12-year-old or whatever it was, sitting on his shelf for 10 years? I think it's more reasonable that the year that he gambled was the year he was thinking about this, struggled on this, and it's just hashkacha pratis that he ended up printing it that year. I don't have evidence. This is just a complete hunch. The book, when you read it, doesn't look like it was written by a 12-year-old, not because of the scholarship, because of the life experience that's expressed in there. So I'm going with an authorship that's closer to the time of this gambling, 1595. All right. That's speculation. Okay. Next passage. Is the entry is Tes Cheshvan Heishin Ayin Ches. That's the year 1618. He writes, Vayhi acharei mois machmad einai. After this precious person passed away, he's referring to the death of his son Mordechai. Chazarti meroi vadaiga, I returned because of my anxiety. Litzarasi asher tardeni min ha'olam tamid, to the thing that plagued me always, litzchaik, to gamble. It's been 2 years since I was clean. This is so sad. You hear his son saying, Tati, Tati, please, you have to stop. And in order to make him happy, he was taka off for 2 years. Now his son died. And Vigdalti Hara Yom Yom, I did this every day until Pesach Heishin Pei, which is 1620. So that's a long time where he says that he's back into the gambling situation. What's also really interesting is he seems to be aware over here that there's a correlation between his negative emotions and it leading to gambling. And that's going to be a persistent theme in the next few passages. It's when he experiences severe negative emotion that suddenly he finds himself gambling again. Look at the next passage. He's talking here about astrology and the fact that there are heavenly bodies and when a person was born and the position of the heavenly bodies at the moment of their birth determines aspects of their character. This is a big topic, and he believed that, and he writes, though it's only a predisposition, they don't force you to have to engage in certain behavior. Still, it's a really, really strong propensity to engage in that activity, somewhere between coercion and difficulty. So you have where it's difficult to avoid, then it's like, I'm compelled to do it, and then there's some space in between. And he says if you're born under a certain constellation, a certain mazel, then it's somewhere in between. You may be pre-programmed for addiction to gambling, which there's also modern language for that. There are some people who, because of their genetic makeup, are predisposed more than others to fall into addiction. He says, this is the cause of why all of my life I have been involved in the folly of gambling. Though I know with all my heart and soul how terrible it is. Even when I was a child of 12 years, I revealed the negativity for all people in the Chibur Sormeira. Earlier he said he was 13, now he's saying it was 12. Nitfas Shnas Shin Nun Vav Pai Venezia, printed here in 1596. Okay, the title page says 1595. Kigam Ata, still now, Ben Shishim Lezikna, I am 60 years old. And this is right after he described terrible plague that hit the Jewish community in Venice. And so even though we just had this negative experience, and now it's Yom Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, Shin Tzadik Aleph, 1631, it's the fast day of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Nichnasa Bi Ruach Shtos, the negative, that negative thing came into me, v'chazarti l'tzchoik, and I went back to gambling. You can feel his shame. He's ashamed that during a plague, when people are dying, and on a fast day, such a sad day in the Jewish calendar, that he's gambling. And me'az ad Kislev Heishin Sadik Beis, until Kislev 1632 or 1631, I've lost more than 500 ducats, and all that money is borrowed money. All right, so this is really, you're really getting a window into the problems of gambling and the addiction of it over here. But notice, although he doesn't specify, notice, when does he find himself gambling? In a very sad period of time, during lockdown, and on a very sad day on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. It's really interesting. Next passage. He says here, this is the year Tough Bays. Now you're getting close to the time that he's going to pass away. He passed away in 1648. This is 1642. In order for my illness, to heal my illness, I had to spend 130 ducats. So that was problem number one. I spent a lot of money. And problem number two, my wife was driving me crazy day and night. So hiskatzafti, I don't know exactly how to translate that word. I lost control. Also, I lost control. I went back to the sin of Judah, meaning his name. And I did worse than ever before. This is a man, I don't know, I didn't do the cheshbon. He's in his 70s already. He's in his, no, not that old, but he's an older man. He's 4 years away from dying. Yeah, he's in his 60s. And he can't hold himself back. And notice here, what led to it is, one, he needed money, okay. But the other thing is, he writes he was having problems at home. Okay, and finally, Erev Chanukah, Mianu boy. So here he's talking about his son-in-law, whose name was Yaakov. Yaakov was expelled for some crime from Venice. A non-Jewish authority said he can't be there. That's obviously a problem. They petitioned to get him to come back. On the day before Hanukkah, the Venetian government says, no, thank you, we don't want him back in town. I remain sad. I added another reason to be sad. Because on the night of Hanukkah, I went back to the cursed gambling. So there is an element of Hanukkah here. We do know that there were communities that banned gambling, but Hanukkah was a time that it was permitted, which would explain the concept of dreidel. So that's playing a role here. But also notice, it's after a tragedy. So 1, 2, 3, 4 separate times, there's something negative that happens to him, and he finds himself gambling. So where does that leave us? Where that leaves us is as follows. We saw in this story of Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena, we saw the halachic sides. We saw the core halachic sugya we saw. There's obviously so many more details about how to paskin when it comes to gambling and different forms of gambling and many associated questions. But poil mamish, like any area in Yiddishkeit, if a person has a shaila l'maisa, they have to ask a rav to know, but poil mamish, what's mutter? At the very least, we saw this is highly questionable material or projects to be involved in. I think also seeing Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena's life is a reminder that it's not only about the halacha, that there is also about being practical and wise. And even for those people who aren't predisposed to addiction, remember, when you're going with somebody else, how do you know what the other person is predisposed for? And so that's a problem. It was also interesting to me to see, like, there's a wish I have that as you get older, like, these types of problems become less compelling, but they don't go away. Even someone who's obviously a big Talmud Chacham, but also someone who's older and more established in life. And also the idea of avoiding some of the root causes. And as we see for him, some of the root causes is atzvos, is sadness. And hence the importance of always ensuring that we're in a matzav of simcha, because there's also other forms of addiction that we didn't discuss today, and they share many properties with this. And one of them is that a person is more prone to fall into them when they're not in a state of simcha. So I think that is the way I'd like to summarize and conclude this topic.